Welcome to the Intentional Encourager podcast, where each episode brings you compelling conversations and stories designed to entertain, enlighten, and encourage. And now here's your host, Brian Sexton.
And welcome into the Intentional Encourager podcast. I'm your host, Brian Sexton. Thank you for joining us again today. My cup runneth over with the quality, again, of people that have decided to come on the Intentional Encourager podcast. And this is a guy that I have followed and long admired. He is a Hall of Fame keynote speaker and the best-selling co-author of the Go Giver and the Go Giver book series. And Bob's going to tell you how you can get those books. They're incredible. And he is just a fantastic guy. You can find him on LinkedIn at Bob Burg, B-U-R-G, but you can find him right now on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Bob, how are you today, sir?
Terrific, and so great to be with you, Brian. You are one of the most encouraging people I know. It really shouldn't be a surprise.
Bob, it's the blind squirrel theory in full effect. It's a blind squirrel finds a nut every once in a while. I just happen to find my way into some intentional encouragement along the way. But you're so kind. Thank you for your kind words. Bob, I've got to start here. And I've been asking folks since the pandemic started how things have changed in your world. And you being a keynote speaker, obviously your stage is where people will invite you. And now those stages have become virtual. What has been the biggest thing that you have seen changing for you in the way you deliver your message? And have you tailored your message somewhat around the pandemic and trying to do things a little bit differently around the message?
Yeah, those are such great questions. For me, I was very, very fortunate in that, not that there's anything fortunate about the pandemic. I don't want to be misunderstood in that regard, but in terms of my own business, fortunate in that I have been for the last few years really doing less and less on the road. You know, I've been speaking for over 30 years now. The travel part, Brian, was never something I liked. I always loved my business. I loved being able to speak in front of these great audiences, meeting wonderful people. But travel was just, I'm a homebody.
You have to love it. You really do have to love it to do it, because I'm a little bit different bird, Bob. I like traveling. I liked being out and things like that. Mm-hmm. And surprisingly, you know what the surprising thing about the pandemic was? My wife said, I've enjoyed having you home. I about had a heart attack.
That's funny. That's funny.
But traveling is, for years, though, you had to do that as a part of the
and
business.
The reason why I always say, I was a good speaker, but not that good. They didn't come to me. Right?
I don't believe that for a second. I don't believe that for a second, my friend.
Well, you're too kind. But, so over the last few years, and I'm at the time we're doing this, I'm close to being 63. So over the last few years, I've been pulling back on the number of out-of-state engagements anyway. So to me, when the pandemic really hit, and I think it was March, that it just really kind of, there were speaker friends of mine, Brian, who, boom, 50 engagements just off the books. And with me, it just wasn't that bad. So it's been sort of, for me to be able to just say, okay, you know what, I'm just doing these, any keynotes, I'm just doing them from right here. And so it's been great with me. And I've made the decision now that even after this COVID pandemic ends, I'm not traveling anymore. So not getting on a plane again. So even after this, all of my engagements will be virtual. So to me, it really wasn't as much of an adjustment. It's one of those things with old age, you get some of those things where it's not as much of a shock.
Just for Men is a wonderful product, Bob, as you can tell. It does wonders to get the gray out of, keep you looking younger and more virile as I rapidly barrel toward 50. And so I know exactly what you're saying. I got to ask you this, piggybacking off of what you just said there. When you think about, you talked about other speaker friends of yours and those folks that do that professionally, do that for a living. Uh-huh. Was there ever, did you ever have a wonder in your mind of, is this now going to be the new normal? Or was it for you this was the perfect opportunity to do something that you had always really wanted to do in kind of scaling back and doing more virtual things?
I had never really thought of doing virtual presentations as keynotes. That was strictly a COVID thing. I just knew I was pulling myself off the road more, just because as you get older, there's just fewer things you're willing to do, that you just don't, the part of it that you don't love to do. So, and we have my business partner, Kathy Tajanel, who's absolutely a genius and really runs the business end of it. We've put together over the years, other income streams and ways of doing business. It's a lot of fun, such as our certified go-giver speaker licensing program, online video course, and things like that. So between that and so forth, I was able to really pull myself off the road more and not have it be a burden. But I really hadn't thought of the virtual speaking, but I got to tell you, I really love it. I've been doing it now, and it's a joy. I charge a lot less, obviously, than if I was to, but I'm loving it personally. And it's, my clients seem to be happy with it, which is the big thing. That's the important part. So yeah.
Bob, that's a great point. Message always resonates. It doesn't matter if it's given virtually. It doesn't matter if it's given in person. Whenever you have a message that is powerful, and I tell people this all the time, I say, look, the one thing that I hope I do is care. I said, what's that mean? Well, I want to be consistent, authentic, relatable, and engaging. And when you have a message like that, when you have a message like that, it doesn't matter if you're virtual or if you're in person. So what was the biggest adjustment that you had to make? Because I would have to think all the years of keynote speaking, there is, when you're in front of people and you that's what you do for a living. Whether you're a performer, you're on stage, things like that.
Sure.
There is a certain rush, so to speak. I've sang for a lot of years, and when you do a live performance, there is a rush of wondering if the audience is getting your message, hearing what you're doing. Are they appreciative? And I have to think in speaking, it's the same way. What was the biggest adjustment for you going to a virtual platform versus speaking live for so many years?
I think there is that concern that because you're, and I agree with you, the medium really in the end doesn't matter. Okay. It's all about, are you providing value to them? Are you relating to them? Are you focused on them? Have you done your homework so that you know what they need, what they want, what they desire, and how to deliver it? And still, there's that little difference that, when you're on stage, and assuming it's not one of those where it's dark and you can't see the audience. Most of the ones I do aren't like that. So I can usually see the audience. I can go to my go-to people who are nodding and so forth. And I can get a general feeling of whether it's connecting. And while you can still, look at people while you're virtual, it's different. There is a difference. So I think there was some nervousness, and I don't think the nervousness has gone away yet in terms of that either, but nervousness of, am I going to be able to really connect online in the same way that I can when I'm actually in front of people, which I was so used to doing.
I have been really focusing a lot the last year on connection. My new book, People Buy From People, is a book about connection.
That's such a great title.
My dad, Bob, I'll share this with you. And I've told some people this, and the audience may know this. When my dad told me that 25 and a half years ago, when I got my first sales job, I thought my dad was giving me a good piece of sales advice. And I got halfway through my book trying to write a sales book and realized that my dad was talking to me about connection. And really that book could have been People Buy Connection. For you as a longtime keynote speaker, how valuable has connection been to you now in the virtual setting that you're in as opposed to the live setting? Because you just hit on something really important there. You do key on certain people that will nod their head. If you watch a preacher,
my go-to people like that.
I mean, I've done preaching and things like that. And so you want to make sure that your points are hitting home, and you'll look for people that are nodding their head or saying amen, things like that. Now, in a speech that you give, if they're saying amen, then you're probably in a different audience. But
yeah. But you bring up an important point though. And here's a difference between what I did after I got some experience and what I did at the beginning. And you brought this up, and I love this. When I was first starting in speaking, I would notice the people who did not seem to be enjoying the message. I'd look at the people who were like this, or the people who seemed to not being paying attention, which, by the way, you didn't really know what they were thinking. But as an insecure younger speaker, you're thinking, oh no, what am I doing? They don't. And I would gear my talk to them. I'd be trying to impress them, try to get them to like me. Mm-hmm. And, I after, a while of doing that, and it really not having a good effect on me or the presentation. And I was counseled by some older or, more veteran speakers. No, first of all, you're not going to please everyone, no matter how. Secondly, you don't really know what they're thinking, which is true, because there were times that people in the audience who were, they were just processing the information that way, because they came up to me afterwards and told me how, oh, that was what have you. But also, no, focus on the people who are really getting it and who are encouraging you, as you would probably call it, your amen corner.
Yeah.
Saying,
the one person I had to
saying amen.
Bob, the one person that I had to please in that was my wife. If my wife was nodding her head in agreement and she was with me, I was good. I was good because, she's like, I got to, that's why my wife doesn't listen to the podcast. She's like, I hear you talk enough as it is. Why do I want more of your pontification? Hey everybody, Brian Sexton here. I want to tell you about our sponsor, SEO National. SEO stands for Search Engine Optimization. Now, what's that, you might say? Well, Search Engine Optimization helps you show up higher on search engines in front of paying customers for words that you as a business owner can monetize. What a great concept. SEO National is owned by my good buddy Damon Burton, who's been a guest here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. Not only has Damon and his team worked with businesses of all sizes, from e-commerce startups to NBA teams and Shark Tank featured businesses, but more importantly, Damon and his team are about transparency, trust, and providing lifetime value. So much so that he still has his first customers after opening SEO National 14 years ago. Let me give you some intentional encouragement and call Damon and his team today at 855-736-6285 or go to www.seonational.com and get a free quote. But I got to ask you this. Your Go Giver series is so good. And I have had several people that have said to me, you got to get it. And I will get a copy of the Go Giver. I've got to do that. What was an aha moment that you had around the Go Giver series that you had never considered when you started writing the Go Giver series?
Okay. So I think the biggest aha was who our first adopters were. And first of all, for whatever success the Go Giver and the Go Giver series has had, I've got to really credit my co-author, John David Mann, because he, I'm a how-to author. I'm step 1, step 2, step 3. All my books before the Go Giver series and since then are how-to books. John is a brilliant writer. He is a master storyteller. So it's really a collaboration, because my name's first, because of the name B, the last name spelled B with a B. I get, so much credit for that, when really it's John's magnificent writing. So I just want to, make sure to acknowledge that. I think the biggest surprise, if you will, was when we both were getting emails from people who were already very, very successful. They were successful long before the Go Giver was published. And what they said is, this is how I did it. This is how I did it. And this is what I've tried to tell other people.
Wow.
Is how I did it. And they wouldn't accept it. And you think about it, why? Well, because look at the messages we get from the world around us. Right? Yeah. We get these horrible anti-prosperity messages, anti-free market messages, anti-business messages, you know, whatever messages, you know, it's always, you know, look at, and I don't mean to be political here, and I apologize, but look at
please say what you want to say. No,
but
absolutely.
I mean, look at how much in the primaries of the last election cycle where people were actually saying millionaires and billionaires shouldn't exist.
Yeah.
I mean, really, you know, I mean, how do you even justify saying something like that? Now, obviously, if someone made their money through illegal, immoral, unethical, well, of course, and there's plenty of people in the world, and people do bad things, but in a the basically free market economy in which we live, and here I'm not talking about cronyism, I'm not talking about industry and special interest buying government favors that provide that. No, I'm talking about the millions and millions of people who go out there every day trying to add value to others, and where people are not forced to buy from anyone else. The only way you can become a millionaire, and dare I say a billionaire, is by providing immense value to the lives of lots and lots of people. Okay. And so, you know, so we get these messages about, you know, if you have money, you did something bad, or, well, it's horrible. But anyway, so now we go back to you know, why people wouldn't believe that these people who did so well, how they did so well. And so these people would get the books and buy them for their team members, their proteges, their people who they wanted to spread the message to. Okay. And this happened a lot. Now, the second wave of adopters were the people who were told about the book from someone who they respected and were successful. Yeah. And it was like, oh yeah, this is exactly how so-and-so said they did it, but I didn't believe them. You know, we hear that so much, and it just, you know, goes to show. So that was now in retrospect, maybe it shouldn't have been a surprise, but that was a surprise both to John and to, you know, and to me.
I grew up a baseball fan.
Me too.
And there was a book that was written decades ago that Ted Williams wrote. And some people will argue that Ted Williams is the greatest hitter that ever lived. And he wrote a book called The Science of Hitting. And I can imagine, Bob, to your point about first and second adopters, it's almost like handing your 10-year-old who's starting to play Little League and has some ability, handing him this book, or her if she plays softball, and saying, if you want to be a great hitter, read this book, The Science of Hitting by Ted Williams.
Well, thank you. I appreciate your even mentioning me in the same sentence as the splendid Splinter.
Absolutely. Well, but I say that, Bob, because again, there were so many big league hitters that when Ted Williams was still alive, like Tony Gwynn and Pete Rose and people like that would seek out Ted Williams's counsel about hitting and would follow his guidelines and principles about hitting because they wanted to be a better hitter themselves.
Yeah.
And Williams, and I don't want to belabor the point, but Williams was so gifted. A lot of the things that he did were so gifted. His eyesight was so good that he could pick up a dot on a 95-mile-an-hour fastball with the ball spinning to the plate. That's how good it was. Right. And there's just some things that you can't teach or you can't put into a book that you just have naturally. But I said all that to say this is that I kind of feel like what you're saying is that these team members were putting the go-giver in their team's hands and saying, if you want to have a modicum of success in the ways that you want to have that modicum of success, you might want to read this book and let it help you.
Yeah, I think it was that third-party credibility. You know, they're not going to listen to me because they know me too well. So let's get this book that says basically the same thing I've been trying to tell them for years, and just give them the book and let them see. And then they go, hey, did you see this idea that they talked about in there? Oh, sure. Yeah, great idea. Keep doing what you're doing. You know, and that's
I really had you on to talk about baseball, so I mean, I hope that's.
Well, I got to tell you. So one of my favorite stories is a Tony Gwynn story.
Oh yeah, I would love to hear that.
I haven't heard this story for a while, so I hope I don't mess it up too bad. And I don't remember who exactly said this, but one of the great pitchers who pitched during Gwynn's day, Mr. Gwynn's day, was asked about, how to pitch or about his secret of pitching and what he had to do. And he said, well, the secret of being a great pitcher is this. You've got to, and he went through like 3 or 4 or 5 things that a pitcher would be able to do, an experienced pitcher. And he said, and that will work. He said, you do that and you're going to have great success, except if you're facing Tony Gwynn, you just hope for the best.
Well, I grew up a Cincinnati Reds fan. I grew up I was a young kid in the tail end of the Big Red Machine. So I grew up. I grew up watching.
They beat our Red Sox in '75 in the greatest series that perhaps there's ever been.
I 100% agree. And I grew up. This is Reds country where I live. So they were my dad's team. Mm-hmm. We lived 3 hours from Cincinnati. I talk about it in my book. The first time I went to Riverfront Stadium, I was 5 years old, and Pete Rose is playing, and Johnny Bench, and Tony Perez, and Ken Griffey and Cesar Geronimo. And
the Big Red Machine was just awesome.
Yeah, they were tremendous. And then they had in 77, they traded for Tom Seaver, again, a tremendous player. But that team, it was all about, for them, it wasn't about, they were just so consistent. They were just so good for a long period of time, because their guys didn't lead the league in any categories. I mean, Rose might have led the league in hits, and Perez might have led the league in RBIs, but they didn't have astronomically gaudy numbers. They were just so consistently good. They just knew how to win. Yeah. That's what made them so good.
They did. They were amazing. And then, you had people like Joe Morgan, who was probably the most underrated second baseman, if not ball player ever, who was just so good and such a spark. And wow. And I remember hearing the story that in the World Series, I think it was the 5th or 6th game or something, I'm not sure, but that Pete Rose came into third, and after the play was over, he looked at Rico Petrocelli, the third baseman, and said, "Heck of a game, isn't it?"
Yeah, he said, this is so much fun. This is the great. Yeah. It was like the 10th or 11th inning of that of that 12-inning game, and that's the famous Carlton Fisk home run. And what people don't understand is that game would have never gone to extra innings had there not been former Red Bernie Carbo, who hit a pinch hit home run,
to center
which
field.
Was incredibly improbable because Bernie Carbo didn't hit home runs.
No.
And he hit it off one of the Reds' best relief pitchers, a guy named Pat Darcy. Yeah. And
he had 2 strikes against him. So
and Bob, that was a great Red Sox team. You had Carl Yastrzemski, who was in the later stages of his career, but Jim Rice and Fred Lynn and Dwight Evans and
Carlton Fisk.
They
were a terrific team. It was really one of the best World Series, I think, ever, even after that 2-day rain delay between the 5th and 6th game. And, it was such a great series. Oh, man, and it's raining for these 2 days. Is that going to take away? And, during the 6th game, it was like it never stopped.
Baseball
what a great series.
Baseball in its heyday. I love it. I would be remiss, and you and I could talk baseball all day long and have a great conversation. I would be remiss if I didn't get to your story, because your story is why I wanted to have you on the podcast. And so, Bob, take me as far back as you want to take me from point A to where we are today, and just tell your amazing story, sir.
Okay, I'll do the Reader's Digest version. Okay, I started out in radio doing sports. Okay, and
you don't say. You kind of got that radio voice going.
Yeah, well, and I said the first thing I said about you is we used to call it in the business a great set of pipes, right? You have that, that kind of deep, and it's a great voice.
Who was your favorite? I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm sorry to interrupt you, but who was your favorite? Growing up, you started in sports radio. Who were some of your influences or some of your heroes in radio back then?
Well, okay. So, I mean, listening to the Red Sox games back then, because I grew up in the Boston area, of course. And so back then they went from TV to radio in the different booths. So Ned Martin was always great to listen to. Ken Coleman was fantastic. On radio, there was a guy on WHDH, which was the big AM station at the time, which again, in my day, AM was, pretty much, and it was a guy named Dan Davis, and Dan had. And
I love Dan Davis. He
no,
went
wait,
to
there was a Dan
ESPN Radio.
Davis that worked for ESPN. This is a
Yes.
different one, actually.
Okay, I thought that was the same one because
right.
he called the famous Doug Flutie play.
Yeah, no, this is a different Dan Davis, actually, and I apologize for misleading it first with that, because I forgot there was the ESPN Dan Davis. No, this was a guy, he was the WHDH sports anchor, and he had this magnificent deep voice. Dan Davis, HDH Sports, and just a great, and and I remember once I was covering a tennis tournament in Boston. I can't remember what it's called, but it was the big one that they used to have there every year. And Dan Davis was there. Of course, it's like seeing Mickey. It's like a young ball player seeing Mickey Mantle. A young sportscaster seeing Dan Davis. And I introduced myself. Couldn't have been nicer. Just he invited me to come. To come to the HDH station one day and watch. I mean, what a great guy. And, it just really goes to show that, that really the bigger people are, the nicer they typically are. And I just remember, and I remember he was, and here was a really cool thing about Dan Davis, because when I was at the station and he was asking me about how he put together some of the sports stories or he was actually showing me how he does one. He said, what you want to do is, he said, for the soundbite that you use, just ask one question so you don't have to go through, everything to get and put that in the story. And I said, oh man, I said, oh wow, Mr. Davis, I've been doing it all wrong. I've been asking tons of questions because I never know exactly if what I'm asking is the right one. And then I find the one to use. I said, thank you for telling me. And here's what he said. He said, Bob, he said, actually, you're right. He said, I asked the one question because I've been doing this for 40 years. He said, when I was your age, that's exactly what I did too. So you're right. Keep doing what you're doing. And I thought, wow, what a great guy. No ego. It was just, he had said something. And I was just saying, wow, thank you. Because he said, no, you're right. I mean, wow. That takes confidence and that takes class to do something. And I think that's something that as leaders, we can all learn. We don't always need to be right.
Was that kind of the first seminal moment for you that you saw go-giving in action? Because this was a guy that didn't have to. You were a young sportscaster, and he showed you he gave you a gracious piece of advice in that moment. Was that the first time that you really saw that in action in your professional career?
In my professional career, I would say yes. I would also go back to, do you remember Bobby Orr from the Bruins?
Absolutely remember Bobby Orr. Great hockey player.
Absolutely amazing.
Number 4, Bobby Orr.
Number 4, Bobby Orr. Absolutely. And I was covering a celebrity golf tournament near, where I lived. And now Bobby Orr, you got to realize, in Boston was sort of like Ted Williams. I mean, he was just, wow, Bobby Orr. And I remember seeing, and Bobby Orr was one of the guest celebrities who was participating in the golf tournament. So Bobby Orr's car came and everyone's crowding around. It's Bobby Orr. And I thought, this is a great opportunity to get a quick question and answer from that I could put on just so I could have Bobby Orr on the thing. I can't tell you how nervous I was. Like 19. No, well, I must have been about 20, 21, 22 or whatever. But I was a young kid.
He's Boston royalty. He with Yaz and
Absolutely.
Ted Williams and guys right like that. He's exactly. Boston royalty. So why would you not be? It would be like a young kid like myself as a Reds fan meeting Pete Rose or Johnny Bench.
Exactly. So I start to walk over to Bobby Orr, and I was nervous, and I think he could probably tell I was. As soon as I got up and I said, Mr. Orr, could I ask you a really quick question? And he went, sure. And you know what he did? He took his arm and he locked his arm with my arm, and we walked together as I asked him the question. I mean, holy cow. I mean, it was like we were best buddies. Sure. Mr. Orr, could I ask you a really quick question? Sure, absolutely. lock his arm with mine, just talk like we were friends. I mean, that's such empathy, and such humility. And by the way, that's from everybody who ever talked about Bob Orr. That's what they said. You would never know he was anyone special by how he carried himself and spoke to others.
You were really fortunate in having interactions with people that you admired that turned out to be really well, because sometimes, because sometimes people can come across. I remember the first time I met Reds Hall of Fame broadcaster Marty Brennaman. I had listened to Marty Brennaman since I was a kid. I can remember my dad having a white alarm clock radio in the late 70s, and that's what we would listen to Reds games. We get in the car and listen to Reds games. The first time I met Marty Brennaman, I met Marty Brennaman, and Joe Nuxall the same, because I grew up on those voices. And sometimes the people that you meet that you admire are not the people that you thought they were. You are very fortunate in that respect. As you go on in your broadcasting career, what were some other things that you were able to do in your broadcasting career that stand out to you? Maybe somebody you met or somebody like that, or those are fantastic stories, Bob.
Well, it was a pretty short broadcasting career, because after radio, I then I got a job on TV as a news guy for a very, very small ABC affiliate in the Midwest, and I worked my way up to the late night news anchorship. But I really wasn't very good. I was a sports guy. I really wasn't a news guy. That's just
what was that like for you transitioning? Because I got to think you grow up in the Boston area. You work Boston radio, which is a major metropolitan city.
Oh, but I was on the outskirts. I was small town.
But again, you go from the Northeast to the Midwest.
Oh, that was an adjustment.
Yeah, take me through that a little bit. What was a challenge that you faced that you probably weren't prepared for? Because when people transition, they move up to these different markets, and sometimes you have to go from a larger market to a smaller market to work your way back up in broadcasting and things like that. It's always seemed to have been that way. What was that adjustment like for you moving to the Midwest from the Northeast?
Well, so I moved to a little town called Ada, Oklahoma. It was for KTEN TV, which is no longer there, but they were the ABC affiliate there. So first, growing up in Massachusetts, I never realized, what a Boston accent I had. I just thought we spoke regular, you went to the park, and who thought anything, different of it. You pronounced the R's that weren't there, and you didn't pronounce the ones that were. So even when I was doing sports, I was, kind of getting made fun of about that. So I took a diction course at a local college, and I can't tell you how many hours I walked around my house practicing, the way to speak. But by the time I got to Oklahoma, I hadn't totally lost that accent yet. And by the way, I can't stand the Boston accent now, only because once I realized what it was. There's people who say, "Oh, I love the Boston accent." Well, and it probably is a great accent, but once I realized I had it, that's all I could, know. And so I tried so hard to lose it, and I pretty much have, unless I get excited and I start, talking.
And think about the transition from going from the Northeast with the Boston accent, going to Oklahoma.
Oh, sure.
It would almost, like, from an accent standpoint, it would almost be like landing on a foreign planet.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Plus, I mean, there was also, a little bit of the cultural difference where you have a, Northeastern Jewish kid going to really the Bible Belt of Oklahoma. Now, of course, growing up in Massachusetts, my friends were all, Catholic and Protestant, and so there wasn't any, but religion up in the Northeast isn't quite as really out there in public, you know what I'm saying, as when you get to small town Oklahoma. But the people there were absolutely wonderful to me. I couldn't have enjoyed living in Ada, Oklahoma more. Just wonderful people. But it was sort of like, sometimes Mork from Ork type of thing, where, you know, you were in, you're in
Yeah.
a place where there were a lot of differences, and, you
Yeah.
know.
Hey, everybody, Brian Sexton. I want you to go check out my new book, People Buy From People, 10 Powerful People Lessons from the Ultimate People Person, my dad. My dad was the ultimate connector and the ultimate intentional encourager. And he shared with me 10 connecting lessons that I'm going to share with you in this book, interwoven with stories and personal anecdotes that will help you really see what connecting is truly all about. If you want to be a more powerful, stronger, deeper connector, whether you're in ministry or leadership or sales, you own a business, whatever you want to do that connects you with people and you want to connect with them stronger, deeper, and more powerfully, People Buy From People is for you. I want you to go to Amazon.com and search People Buy From People, Brian Sexton, and it's available in paperback and Kindle, and coming soon, excited about this, coming soon to Audible. Thank you in advance for picking up a copy of People Buy From People. And now let's get back to a great conversation here on the Intentional Encourager podcast.
You were like, you know, 7 Jews who lived in the town, and many of them had never met one, and, you know, and that, so
and a lot less traffic in Ada, Oklahoma than there is in the greater Boston area.
Yeah, well, sure. And but really though, the people couldn't have been more nice and kind and more welcoming. I made some of my best friendships there, and yeah.
What prompted you to transition away from broadcasting? Because there are a lot of guys and gals that make it to a certain level and they're asked to leave. They're you know, because and look what's happened now in the world of journalism and broadcasting, where there's a lot of great talented people that are just being forced out of the business just because it's compressing.
Yeah.
It's really compressing. What was that moment like for you when you started transitioning from broadcasting into the next phase of your life?
I just realized I really wasn't very good at the news stuff. I mean, I could read the news. That's pretty easy, but I certainly was not a journalist. And nothing in sports was, you know, really opening up there. And you know, had I had an opportunity to maybe be a game show host, I think I would have done pretty well with that, but that wasn't the opportunity. So I started selling.
Well, not in Ada, Oklahoma. Yeah, there's no game shows
exactly,
that are filming in Ada, Oklahoma.
Exactly. And and so I started selling advertising for the station just to make some extra money, because again, small town. It wasn't like I was making a lot of money. And so I floundered for the first few months of sales, because I had no sales, you know, formal sales background. Fortunately, one day I was in a bookstore, and I came across 2 books on selling, which doesn't seem like a big deal now, but 40 years ago, that was a big deal. I didn't even know there was such a thing, a book on how to sell. I thought it was just knocking on doors, talking to people, blah, 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 which of course is not selling, but that's, you know, what did I know? And I got 2 books. One was by Zig Ziglar, and one was by Tom Hopkins, 2 of the icons of the sales industry. And I always say I never read the books. I devoured the books. And I would just come home after my day, and I would, into the wee hours of the morning, I would read and study and highlight and note take and, you know, scribble and rehearse. And within about 3 weeks, my sales began to go through the roof. I mean, it was a marked difference. And the difference was I now had a methodology. I now had a system for doing so. I am not a invent the wheel type of person. I'm not that smart.
I'm glad you mentioned Zig, Bob. I've got to jump in there. I'm glad you mentioned Zig, because one of Zig's quotes is one of my very favorite quotes. And I can see you, I can envision how would devouring those books would change you, because Zig always said encouragement is the fuel that powers hope. And when you're encouraged, you're empowered. And so I can begin to see, as you're telling that story of and by the way, you read those books 40 years ago. You could give those books to someone today and read them. And a lot of that stuff that Zig and Tom were talking about still applies even today. But I think what made Zig so good was that he knew how to speak to a lot of people and put himself right. It was almost like Zig was probably sitting in the room with you and talking to you and saying, but now, Bob, you can do this. Now, Bob, you can do that. It's been a joy getting to know Tom, his son. Tom's a friend of mine.
Oh, Tom, I just love Tom.
Tremendous.
Tom is carrying on his dad's legacy in such a wonderful way. And, it's one of the greatest experiences I ever had. One of the greatest thrills was when I used to hold, my business partner and I used to hold an event in Orlando every year where we'd have a whole bunch of speakers come in and so forth. Well, so in this particular year, we wanted to present Zig with the first annual Go Giver Lifetime Achievement Award.
Oh, wow.
So
yeah.
This is about 10 years ago. And I don't know if you know that Zig's the last couple of years of Zig's life, he had suffered from a head trauma, a very bad head injury in which he had very
Tom talked about that here on the Intentional Encourager podcast. And I saw Zig in Charleston, West Virginia in 2008. And I write about it in the book because Zig's daughter, Julie would feed him some questions. Right. And Zig was just, when he was in that vein of just being Zig and everything was just coming back, you could see the clarity as he just began to just pour out of himself all that wisdom and all that knowledge. And I was just frantically writing and taking notes because I loved Zig. And I shared that story with Tom, and Tom shared how his dad had suffered a head injury. Ironically, Zig died about a week and a half before my own father passed away. It's very, and I've shared that with Tom, but I can only imagine the impact. I've got to ask you, I've got to go here for just a minute, if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
The impact that Zig had on you, were you able to tell Zig what his impact meant to you? Because I believe in telling people while they're here what their impact means to me, if they have profoundly impacted me. What was that conversation like when you guys presented Zig with that award?
Yeah. So he was on stage and Mrs. Ziegler was on stage with him. And so was Tom. Julie was not able to attend that one, but Tom was. And when I presented the award, I actually got to do an imitation of Zig from, one of his tapes, because I tell the story about how when I got his tapes, I listened to them 15 times in a row. And on the 16th time, he gave me the answer to a question that I had, and somehow I missed them the first 15 times. But on the 16th time, he answered that question, right? And I got to actually do an impersonation of Zig on stage in front of Zig. And you could tell that he knew, it was he didn't quite, understand exactly, but you could tell he knew that it was a tribute to him. And but here's the thing. Afterwards, when they got off stage, and by the way, Mrs. Ziegler told me that it was the first time ever that she was on stage with Zig Ziglar.
Wow.
Yeah. And
that is so neat.
It's like, oh. So when they got off stage, they, we had them seated somewhere to sign autographs, and I am telling you, it had to be an hour and a half or 2 hours. They just signed autographs for everybody who wanted one. They hugged everyone who wanted a hug. They talked to people who wanted to talk. For I was going to say for months, it probably was months, but I'm thinking for weeks. I got emails from people who had attended the program saying, with all the great speakers who were there, and we had a lot of great speakers at that event, that just seeing that Zig and Mrs. Ziegler and Tom, the Zieglers, were the exact people off stage as they are on stage.
Yeah.
Was just one of the most beautiful things ever.
Tell me the greatest lesson you learned from Zig when you were going through that time.
I can tell you another about.
Please do. Please.
It was about a year later, and I was at their offices. I was going to be on Tom's. Tom had a webcast at the time, a video webcast. And so the guest speaker who would come on that Tom would interview beforehand, Tom and the guest would go out to lunch with his dad, with Zig. So we're at the restaurant. And again, remember, Zig with his head injury didn't remember what he was, saying from one thing, 1 minute sometimes to the next. And he'd repeat himself. And it was always, by the way, so beautiful how his kids just so lovingly honored him by just gently working with him. And it was just so wonderful. But Zig was talking about encouragement, right? He was talking about how the biggest thing missing today for kids is encouragement. Okay, now, so that I just thought was cool. But here's what was just awesome. Where Zig was at that point in his life, at his age, and again with his head injury, he said, Bob, every day I learn something new, and here's how I do it. And he reached into his pocket, and he took out a notepad and his pen, and he showed me right there that he's still learning. He's still learning,
Wow.
Oh,
What a man. What a man. One of my heroes. And it was, I'll tell you this, Tom and I connected, we connected a couple of years ago. And what I love about Tom is he is so gracious. And I said, Tom, I don't mean to continue to fawn on about your dad. The impact was just so great. And he said, Brian, don't worry about it. The impact was great on me as well,
Yeah.
And so I love that. Please, very quickly, and I want to be respectful of your time and the audience's time, Bob. When you are going through that time in sales and how, because I get a sense that there are some folks that might be in a Bob Burg place themselves, where they're doing something on the side to make some extra money. They're trying to figure out through this pandemic that maybe there's something else for me to do. I normally would save this and have you tell more of your story. I just feel like you've got a word of encouragement. So share with folks your biggest obstacle you overcame and the lesson you learned from it.
Well, biggest obstacle in life is having obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD, and having that since the time I was a little kid. It wasn't diagnosed till I was about 26, because back then when I was growing up, who knew about that? So it's a very debilitating, it's very different from when people say, oh, I'm so OCD about that. They don't even have a clue. Totally different thing. It's a chemical imbalance in the brain, and it's very debilitating. So that's something I've always had to live with and so forth. And I can't, and there's nothing about having obsessive compulsive disorder that would help one be successful. Now, someone can be obsessive about things or compulsive about things, and maybe that is helpful, but this is a whole different thing, this disorder. You don't succeed because of OCD, you succeed despite OCD.
Yeah.
And so while I can't think of anything good that has come from it, I will say this: it probably instilled in me a real highly developed sense of empathy for the pain of others. And it allows me to kind of really put myself in another person's shoes in terms of their pain, and helps me to really focus on them. Now, in terms of a lesson that I learned that I think any and every salesperson can use, it was spoken to me by a very wise man who, this is a couple of years after I was in sales, and I've been doing pretty well, but I was in a sales slump. And in this slump, I started really focusing on myself and how am I going to get out of it? And I was panicking. I made it all about me instead of who it should be about, my customers, right? And I remember a very wise man. I didn't know him very well, but he was a very wise man. Whenever he said something, it was always very profound. And I think he saw me as sort of like Joe in the story that I would co-author 20 years or 25 years later, a young, up and coming, aggressive, ambitious salesperson who was frustrated because as hard as he worked, He was not getting the kind of success he felt, right? And he said to me, can I give you he said, Burg, he was a last name kind of guy. He said, Burg, can I give you a piece of advice? I said, absolutely, please do. And he said, if you want to make a lot of money in sales, he said, don't have making money as your target. Your target is serving others. Now, when you hit the target, he said, you'll get a reward. And that reward will come in the form of money. And you can do with that money whatever you choose. But never forget, the money is simply the reward for hitting the target. It ain't the target itself.
Yeah.
Your target is serving others.
Wow.
And that's when it hit me. That's when it really hit me that great salesmanship is never about the salesperson, just as great leadership is never about the leader. Great salesmanship is never about the product or service, as important as that is. Great salesmanship, like great leadership, is always about the other person. It's about those whose lives you want to bring value to. It's about other people's lives being just a little bit better because you were part of it. And I think when we are able to shift our focus from what I call an I focus or me focus to an other focus, now we're really 9 steps ahead of the game in a 10-step game.
That is so good. That is so good. I've got to ask you this last question. You've been so gracious with your time. There's a lot of different ways we could carry the conversation, and we will. We'll have to record another episode because, Bob, there's so much there.
Right.
Please share with the audience your biggest piece of intentional encouragement.
Oh, my biggest piece of intentional encouragement, I think in a sense it's believing so much in your personal mission, in the value you're looking to bring to the world that, I think if you believe in it enough and you believe that you're really there for something bigger than yourself, you really can be unstoppable.
Wow. So good. So good. The Go Giver series, you can find it on, tell folks where they can find it. I don't want to try to tell them where they can find it. I want the author to tell them where they can find the Go Giver series.
Best place is probably just at the website, Burg, BURG.com. And there's a whole bunch of other fun resources there you can check out.
Burg.com, B-U-R-G. Very simple enough. Bob Burg.
I'm a simple guy.
Well, I mean,
simpleton, some people.
Well, yeah, I mean, look at me, the Intentional Encourager podcast. You can't get much simpler than this. But Bob, this has been so good. I've looked forward to this conversation for a good while. I've admired you and your work, and what an honor it is to have you today on the Intentional Encourager podcast. And I do thank you so much for your time.
The honor is mine.
My thanks as always to producer Bryce Sexton and technical advisor Matt Means. And the ultimate thanks goes to the Lord Jesus Christ, who provides intentional encouragement every day through His Word. And until next time, remember, everyone, everywhere, at any time, and any place can be an intentional